I'd like to welcome everyone once again to this seminar, public seminar, to be delivered by Professor Steve Ellner. I'm sure now, familiar faces, this is now the third seminar or public lecture Professor Ellner has done here at the ANU. So I think you're probably all aware of his background and attributes already, but for those perhaps who haven't been, a couple of people perhaps who haven't been to either of the other performances so far, Professor Ellner is a major expert on questions of the labour movement and the left in Latin America, but particularly, of course, in Venezuela, where he's lived since 1975, at a number of universities in Venezuela, and has also been a visiting professor at a number of other major universities in North America and Latin America. Today is his final performance at the ANU, but not his final performance in Australia. He has a couple of other talks to do in Sydney, I think early next week. But I'll say a little more at the end, but just by way of introduction, I'd like to thank you very much for his contribution to ANCLIS here, the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies, which has been very, very valuable. I think it's given us a whole new insight on Venezuela that really we had no other way of getting, given our access to media and information about Venezuela and so on. And today, in this third seminar, Steve is going to be talking about Venezuela's radical social-based democracy model and Latin American populism. And he's going to speak for up to an hour, 50 minutes, an hour, something like that.
Okay.
And then there'll be plenty of time, at least half an hour or so for discussion. I want to say that at the conclusion of this seminar, we are all invited, personally invited, by the Venezuelan ambassador back to his residence in O'Malley for drinks and snacks and so on. While we may stay around here for a little while to have a discussion. And those who want to go there, more than welcome. I'll give you the address at the end. Thank you.
Okay, I noticed that most of the people whose faces I see today, I also saw on at least one of the two other days that I gave talks. So, what I emphasized in the two other talks is that explanations for the Chavez phenomenon that focus on rhetoric, that focus on style, that focus on discourse, is to a certain extent superficial. That an exclusive focus on discourse or an exclusive focus on style really doesn't get at the root of what Chavismo is all about. Not to say that discourse is not important, but if you don't look at the different factors involved in the process of change in Venezuela, and if you just focus on Chavez, and if your assumption is that Chavismo is all about Chavez and Chavez's charismatic leadership, you miss out on the other key element, which is the people and the interaction between Chavez and the people. It's not that Chavez is just sitting down calling the shots or standing up and calling the shots. It's that he's interacting with the people. And today I'll give you several examples of how I see that having worked out in practice in specific cases. There is a book that came out just recently by Kirk Hawkins on populism in Chavez in Venezuela that explains populism in Venezuela on the basis of a Manichaean discourse of black and white, of good and bad, good and evil. And that is related to populism because one of the characteristics of populism is that populist leaders tend to polarize. That's one of the standard definitions of populism. So Hawkins refers to the world outlook embedded in Chavez's discourse, and he attributes that to the polarization and the different characteristics of these 12 years of Chavez's rule. And although I think that there's an element of truth in that, I can't help but think that an explanation that focuses on discourse can't explain what I mentioned yesterday, for instance, that Chavez at first was not all that radical. And Chavez, the Chavista government has gone through various stages. And the first stage was a moderate stage. The first stage, even going back to the electoral campaign of 97, 98, so we're talking about really 4 years, from 97 to 2000, the end of 2000, the discourse was constitutional change, constituent assembly, and political reform, not socioeconomic, structural reform. So if Chavez began as a moderate, where did all the hostility to Chavez come from? In 2001, I think the key occurred when Chavez implemented the 47 laws that I mentioned on Tuesday. They were passed simultaneously as part of an enabling act, and most of the laws were not that important. Naturally, 47 is a lot, but one of the laws I mentioned on Tuesday was the agrarian reform known as the Ley de Tierras, and another one, which was extremely important, was the Ley Orgánica de Hidrocarburos, which reasserted state control of the oil industry. Now those are two important laws, and they were socioeconomic laws. And practically overnight, the opposition, supported by the business sector, and eventually supported by the media, organized demonstrations, marches against Chavez. And within a short period of time, in terms of a couple of days practically, they were calling for Chavez to resign. Now, how do you explain that change? It was an overnight kind of change. The opposition was obviously opposed to Chavez. They were the opposition. They were opposed to Chavez during the campaign in 1997-98, and they were opposed to Chavez once he was elected president. But it was a modest kind of opposition. The opposition was not questioning Chavez's right to be president, Chavez's legitimacy. But that changed in the second half of 2001, when the opposition started calling for Chavez's resignation. And those demonstrations became increasingly aggressive, increasingly militant, increasingly confrontational, and that led into the 3 days of the general strike beginning on April 9th, 2002, April 10th. As a matter of fact, let me just say this in the way of an aside. On April 9th, the business organization Fedicames, sort of like the Chamber of Commerce of the United States, and the CTV, which was the main confederation of workers controlled by AD, the opposition party, organized a general strike, called for a general strike. And that general strike, really what it meant was that companies closed their doors, grocery stores, retail stores closed their doors, and that began on the 9th. It started petering out by the second day, at least where I live. My wife and I drove around Barcelona, where we live, and we realized that the strike was really not that successful, at least by the second day. And I was very surprised to hear the leadership of the strike announce that the strike would be continued the following day. Because I thought they had made their statement, and yet they were continuing the strike. Well, that was part of the strategy, because that third day, the strike on the third day, led into the coup against Chavez. So obviously there was a plan there. Now why? Why this sudden change? It seems to me that if you don't look at socioeconomic issues, then you can't really understand this sudden radical change on the part of the business sector and the part of the political parties of the opposition and the labor leaders who were opposed to Chavez. So my focus is a class focus that emphasizes socioeconomic issues. And just as I do that with regard to the opposition, and I talk about class struggle, it's the name of my latest book, the title of the book in English, which is Rethinking Venezuelan Politics, class conflict and the Chavez phenomenon. So I emphasize class and I emphasize conflict, and that has to do with the opposition, the business sector, that felt threatened by these reforms, these 47 laws, and especially the laws related to agrarian reform and also the oil industry. You can say the same thing with regard to the Chavista movement, that if you don't analyze the class constituency of the Chavez movement, you're going to be left with analysis based on the masses. Now, on the theoretical level, there is an interesting debate between two thinkers, two very important thinkers, actually three, who write on postmodernism. One is Ernesto Laclau, the Argentine-British philosopher, political scientist. And the other is Negri Hart, Michael Hart, who teaches at Duke University, and Negri, who have written several important books. One is called Empire, and the follow-up book is called Multitude. And the two sets of authors agree that that the popular sectors of the population are opposed to the system. But Negri and Hart emphasize this idea of an incredible diversity of groups, of organizations, and of people who are opposed to the system. And they leave it at that. The opposition to the system is such that eventually that pressure coming from this multitude, which is the term that they use, is going to bring the system down. That's basically what their argument is. And Laclau, who is also he's not a Marxist, well, he calls himself a Marxist, but he sometimes refers to as a post-Marxist. Laclau says it's not that simple. It's not that simple because we have a great diversity of groups. It's not like the good old days with organized labor representing the sector that's confronting capital, and the locus of conflict and struggle is the factory. Now it's much more complex, much more diverse, because we have hundreds of different social movements with different types of identities, different types of objectives. And so he says that it's not that easy, it's not that automatic. Just because all these groups are opposed to the system, it doesn't mean that they're going to succeed in bringing the system down. And so you need a leader. He calls the leader a populist leader. That's the term that he uses. And that populist leader is able to articulate the different demands and the different hopes and aspirations of all those groups. And then, as political scientists, the term that they always use is the politician articulates and aggregates. Aggregates means you bring together all these different demands. That's what a politician does. That's what politicians do. But Laclau says that there's such diversity that when the populist leader goes to aggregate, he or she is going to present slogans. He or she is going to formulate a discourse that is going to be interpreted differently by each group, because each group has a different mindset. And so that articulation is going to be kind of imperfect. The leader is never going to be able to really unify. There's always going to be divisions. But a successful populist leader succeeds in convincing all those different groups that those slogans that he or she uses is really fit for them. I refer to this because I think that in order to understand Chavismo, you've got to understand the diversity within the Chavista movement. And the fact that not only do you have diversity, but you have conflicting visions, conflicting interests, and conflicting concerns. traditional Marxism, I believe, underestimates those conflicts, those internal conflicts. I mean, Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, and the other famous Marxist leaders, orthodox Marxist leaders, just assumed that you'd have like a peasant worker alliance, and that the convergence of the popular forces led by the workers, because that's what Marxism is all about, the working class vanguard, led by the workers, but never really dealt with the possibility that there might be tensions between that worker vanguard and other sectors that are underprivileged, that are non-privileged, but other sectors that have different interests and different visions. And I think that that's what we see taking place in Venezuela today. And specifically, I make reference to 3 different sectors. One is the organized working class. The other is the middle sector, even though the middle class as a whole is with the opposition. Certainly a large number of Chavistas belong to the middle class. And the third sector, which I think Chavez has prioritized, is the non-incorporated sectors of the population. I briefly talked about that on Tuesday, and I mentioned that definition of non-incorporated sectors, I include the informal economy, or the marginalized sectors of the informal economy who don't have steady work, people who work for companies that are not formally registered, and therefore the workers don't have any rights at all because the company is not recognized by the state. Workers who work for very small companies, who don't have unions, who don't have collective bargaining agreements, and the rural workforce. And I believe that the social base of support of Chavismo from the very outset was this third group, was the non-incorporated sectors of the economy. And I say that even though a lot of workers supported Chavez from the outset, in 2001, the main labor confederation, which at the CTV, which at the time took in the Chavista, took in just about all the trade unionists, with just a few exceptions, held elections for their president. And I believe that the candidate for AD, the opposition, who later on led the coup against Chavez and then the general strike, his name is Carlos Ortega, he's now in exile in Peru. I think there's evidence that he won those elections. They, namely AD, exaggerated, claimed that he received a very high percentage of vote. I think it was 65% or something. And that was exaggerated. There's a lot of accusations of fraud. But even with that, I think he got a majority of the vote. And if that's the case, the Chavista candidate was Aristobalo Isturiz. And if that's the case, then obviously a higher percentage of people in the informal economy were voting for Chavez than workers in the formal economy. In other words, if Aristobalo Isturiz got, and I'm just being hypothetical because the accusations of fraud was credible enough, was plausible enough, so that I really, don't want to use official statistics. But let's say hypothetically that Isturiz got 40% of the vote. Well, Chavez won the elections in '98 with 56% of the vote, and he won the presidential elections in 2000 with 58% of the vote. So if he's getting 58% of the vote as a whole, and the Chavista is only getting 45% of the vote in the trade union elections, obviously more workers in the informal economy are supporting Chavez than workers in the formal economy. Now that changed. After the general strike, the CTV was very much discredited, and they're pretty much out of the picture now. And I think the Chavistas have much stronger control of organized labor than they did in the first couple of years of the Chavez's government. The Chavez leaders, the Chavista leaders, were interested in preparing these non-incorporated sectors of the population Their feeling, I believe, was that these non-incorporated sectors of the population were politically mature, and that was demonstrated during the coup attempt, and demonstrated during the general strike, when those poor people organized, mobilized, and made possible the triumph of the Chavistas in both conflicts. But they don't have organizational skills. The type of organizational skills, the type of organizational experiences that the workers in the formal economy have, just belonging to a union, just having the experience of going to union meetings, going on strike, that kind of thing. That provides experiences and that provides skills that the workers in the informal economy don't have. The social programs are designed to move these sectors of the population along. And I believe that some of the Chavista leaders, and I could mention a few of them, Carlos Lanz is one of them, former guerrilla leader who has had a big input in the formulation of education policy in Venezuela, and also was the president of one of the aluminum companies where he applied worker control, worker participation rather, in that company, Alcasa. Lanz and others were influenced by ECLA, Economic Commission on Latin America. The Economic Commission on Latin America in the 80s and 90s began emphasizing the importance of education, and education in the context of globalization. And they basically said that in the modern world, in the world of globalization, vocational education is not sufficient, because a worker can have the skill, but because of the rapid turnover of technology, the rapid development of technology, that skill becomes obsolete. So it's important, it's necessary to teach the workers not only vocational skills, but communicational skills, interpersonal relations, cultural skills. Education has to be a much more broader kind of effort than just job training. And I think that this influenced some of the Chavista leaders who began talking of the need to educate the popular sectors of the population. And they added one ingredient that probably was not part of the ECLA recommendations, which is political education. And that was all integrated. I mean, the idea was political education was not going to be something on the side. It was part and parcel of the whole educational process. And that's why, you know, I use the term paradigm on the talk on Tuesday, and the criticism of the Community Council of political discussions, and the fact that the community councils are politicized. A liberal democracy model would say no, separation of ideology and the state. The state shouldn't be imposing ideology. But this is a different model. And the Chavistas would say, politics is everywhere. You can't avoid politics. And the fact that these community councils talk about politics, the fact that the Chavistas might go to meetings of the community councils and announce something political, that's legitimate. That's what they would say. The community councils were formed in 2006 in response to the law of community councils that was then reenacted in December of 2009. The new law is the organic law of community councils. And basically what the government did was to jumpstart the community council movement. The government offered different communities money to carry out projects in their community, but that money was contingent on the formation of community councils. So it wasn't a spontaneous movement, it wasn't a movement that came from below, it was encouraged, it was promoted by the government and made possible by oil money. There were cases, that I heard about, probably cases all over the country, but you hear about these cases, of communities that were told, these facilitators, that's a term that's used in Spanish, facilitadores. They would go out, the ministry would send out these facilitators to different communities and say, look, you are eligible for a grant for any kind of project, whatever project you consider to be important, but you have to get together. You have to form a community council and then hold a meeting, because it can't be just an elite group. It's got to be the community council. They call them assemblies of citizens, asambleas de ciudadanas y ciudadanos, assemblies of female and male citizens. And that's where the decision has to come from. So this accounts for some of the rough spots, because the initiative was really not coming from the communities. The initiative was coming from the government, from the state. Maybe in some cases the communities were not ready for the community council, but the money was there. And so these councils were formed with mixed results. But I think that what's interesting is that Venezuela has had a community council movement going back to 1979, actually before, but there was a proliferation of community councils that were known as asociaciones de vecinos, associations of neighbors that were formed under the government of Luis Herrera Campins. But in the case of those associations, you didn't have the close connection between the association and the state. The association formulated demands, they presented proposals, and they might have pressured the state in order to implement those proposals. But that's quite different than the consejos comunales under Chavez, because these community councils under Chavez receive money to carry out the project. That's quite different from an organization that calls on the state to carry out a project with their own workforce or contracting a private company, what have you, but the money is handled by the state. In this case, there are three modalities. One is the community council meets, they decide on the priority project for their community, what the community most wants and needs, and they design that project. And then they present that, they go to the ministry, or they go to the state government, or they go to the municipal government, and they request money in order to finance the project. And the state agrees to carry out that project, but they carry out the project with their own infrastructure. They contract a company to carry out the project, and the community council oversees the work of that company. That's one modality. There's a second modality which is more advanced, and that's the modality in which the state allocates the money directly to the community council and then sends out inspectors to make sure that the work is being performed. But the community council handles the money. They contract the company. In other words, they're the ones that are overseeing the work and in communication with the company. And they are the ones that are allotting the money, assigning the money to the company, paying the company. That's certainly much more advanced, especially when we're talking about non-privileged sectors of the population, marginalized sectors of the population that don't have any kind of experience along those lines. The third modality is when the community council carries out the program paying people who live in the community, with not contracting a company to do it, but doing it themselves with the workforce. And one of the things I always ask in the interviews that I conduct is, do you really think that there are people in the communities that are qualified to carry out these projects? And I always get yes for an answer. There's no hesitation. Even in the poorer communities, they say, oh, we have bricklayers, albañiles, we have electricians, we have plumbers, we have everybody that we need in order to carry out. Now, more advanced projects like electrification, we have to pay a company to do that. But even simpler projects involving building of structures, you know, a communal house or housing for the people who live in the community, or certainly paving streets and sidewalks. People say that you know, there are enough skilled people living in the community to carry out that. Now, the facilitators have encouraged the community councils that receive the money to carry out the project themselves. And one of the reasons for that is the feeling is that the community council, if the people who live in the community are doing the work, they will be more responsible, they will be more disciplined than if a company, a regular company, gets the contract. It's possible that there is a second explanation, and that is that in Venezuela there has always been a lot of corruption with regard to public works projects. And the companies that get contracts, there are always kickbacks. I mean, that's a standard feature of local government, in Venezuela. And the feeling is that if the community council is getting the money directly, the company is not getting a contract, then you're eliminating that tendency to pay the state or pay somebody off in order to get that contract. And there's a third explanation, which I see in some cases, and that is something that has affected a lot of communities, and that is the construction unions, the construction worker unions, which insist on hiring members of their union. And in a lot of cases, there are strong-arm tactics that are used, and there's a lot of cases of violence and death threats and even killings, in which some of these unions, the construction workers unions in Venezuela have a bad reputation. In fact, the Secretary General of the CTV, Manuel Cova, was the head of the construction workers union, and he had quite a record having gone to jail. So those unions have a bad reputation. But actually, in some of the interviews that I've had, I remember one interview that the person said, we're not even talking about opposition union. We're talking about a mafia. This is a mafia that's disguised as a union. But it's a real problem for community councils. And the feeling is, and I'm saying this kind of tentatively because I haven't really done enough interviewing and asked enough people, but my feeling is, up until now, that if the community council carries out a public works project on its own, without going to a company, without contracting a company, then they're not going to be as vulnerable to this pressure from the construction union or from this so-called mafia that a regular company, private company, would be subject to. So I think that this gives you some idea of the learning experience that these community councils represent. Certainly, if these contracts went to private companies, and the old system, under the old system in which you didn't have community councils, and the state government worked directly with contract companies, and even if the companies were corrupt, they would, in the short run, do a better job. They would be more cost efficient than the community councils. The community councils don't have the experience. They don't have the resources. They don't have the technology. They don't have the kinds of skills that the big construction companies have. But this is a learning experience. So there are trade-offs, and I think that this is what you see all along. You know, certain objectives being sacrificed and certain objectives being prioritized. And specifically, I would say that the social-based democracy, which is really what I'm referring to, the marginalized sectors of the population receiving money to carry out these projects in order to promote education, in order to promote skills. This is the essence of what I call social-based democracy. And certainly, the social-based democracy means more emphasis on subjective conditions. In other words, subjective conditions being the transformation of, well, cultural transformation, a sense of participation, a sense of empowerment, which people feel that they have the ability to change things. That's what the term empowerment means. Empowerment means that somebody feels that their effort has contributed to a change that benefits their community. And it's a collective kind of effort. And the feeling that in the future, they will be able to repeat that success story. That's what empowerment is all about. And I think that that has been prioritized by the Chavez government. In fact, the term empowerment, if anybody knows Spanish, which I know several of you do, does the word empowerment exist in Spanish?
Sí,
Well, in Venezuela. ¿Cómo se dice?
Es el motivar a la persona.
Pero ¿cómo se dice empowerment en Spanish?
Es una distorsión de inglés, empowerment es empoderamiento,
Sí.
dar poder.
Sí. And it's interesting that in Venezuela, Chavez and others are using that term empoderamiento. It's not in the dictionary, it doesn't exist,
No.
but the concept certainly does. So,
But the good thing on that word is that the social movements are taking that word in a way to give power to the people, and the people is understanding that they can have power.
right,
El empoderamiento de las clases bajas.
right,
¿Comprenden?
right. And I think that vocabulary says a lot about
Yeah, it's,
what happens. The fact that that word is being used now, I think, is a reflection.
yeah, but that is the part of the essence of community development. I, as a social worker, used to work in community development in sector projects that empower the people to claim ownership and look at the human aspect that you are referring to.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd like to contrast this strategy of social-based democracy with orthodox Marxism and the experience of socialism in the 20th century. Orthodox Marxism emphasizes what the Marxists call objective conditions. Objective conditions means the level of economic development of a country. And Marxism has always stated that that is essential because if the working class is the key agency of change, and in an underdeveloped country, the working class tends to be small, such as in the case of Russia prior to 1917, the Marxists in Russia and elsewhere were saying, well, you have to promote economic development because with economic development, and specifically industrial development, the working class grows, and so you have a sizable working class, and that's the key element in the process of socialist transformation. Same thing with China in 1949. So that objective conditions were considered essential. Also, Marxists have emphasized objective conditions because, and this is really going way beyond our discussion of Venezuela, but what Marx said, this might be of interest to people, that, you know, the word communism gets thrown around so much, but communism really is a futuristic notion for Marx. Marx doesn't really talk much about communism. He was interested in analyzing the system that existed and possible transformation of that system to socialism. But communism was something, it was a long-term objective, and communism implies the transformation of values. And he maintained that the only way those values are really going to get transformed is when the material conditions are so abundant, or so people have such a high level of a standard of living that egotistical kind of motivations, materialism, become less important, and so people can transcend those so-called false values that are associated with capitalism. So that's not socialism. Socialism, you still have the old values. It's only when economic conditions reach a certain threshold where you can think in terms of communism and communist values, okay? So that for Orthodox Marxism, the objective conditions are really essential in their framework, in their thinking, in their theorizing. In the case of Venezuela, the emphasis is on subjective conditions. Empowerment, learning experiences, those are subjective experiences. And that's what's being emphasized in Venezuela. So this is, you know, an essential contrast between orthodox communism and orthodox Marxist thinking and what's happening in Venezuela. And there are other differences, fundamental differences as well, which, you know, when people who belong to the opposition and some of the Chavistas talk about Cuba as being a model, they ignore the fact that this is a democratic road to socialism. It's a gradual road to socialism. And there are all kinds of dilemmas that I talked about briefly in the two other talks, which refer to spaces and opportunities under democratic socialism that are provided to both sides of the battlefield. The opposition has these opportunities that in a repressive or non-democratic state, such as the Soviet Union after 1917, the situation is quite different. I mentioned yesterday the case of the kulaks. They just got, you know, bashed by the state. Some of them were forced to work in work camps, and others were killed. Nobody really knows the details. Nobody knows the numbers, just how many were killed. But obviously there was repression because they resisted socialism and they resisted the policies that the government was trying to carry out in terms of emphasizing urban, industrial development and at the expense of the rural areas. The kulaks resisted those policies, resisted collectivization of agriculture, and so they were forced into these camps and they paid a big price. But in the case of a democratic context, it's a whole different story. And I talked yesterday about how shortages are created. The government just can't go in there and use repressive measures to deal with the problem of shortages. So it's been a tug of war between the private sector and the state. And more recently, just in the last couple of weeks, the government passed legislation on la ley de costos y salarios, no, ley de costos y precios justos, which is an additional mechanism that's going to be used to try to clamp down on the private sector, which is retailing products that whose prices are controlled, but evading those price controls. So the government establishes mechanisms to deal with that evasion, and that has led to expropriations. So it's a much more complicated process. And the same is true with the Chavista camp. You have these three sectors in the Chavista camp, and there are tensions between the different sectors. For instance, with the case of organized labor, the labor unions have felt empowered as a result of the expropriations. And that has given them a certain impetus. And that has opened up opportunities to the labor movement, which until now the labor movement has not been able to take advantage of. Because the Chavista labor movement was very divided. When the general strike failed in 2002, 2003, the Chavistas left the CTV, the main trade union federation, and formed their own confederation, which is called the UNT, Unión Nacional de Trabajadores. And that organization looked very promising. They held a preliminary Congress, and the idea was that they were going to hold elections and create a structure and have a president and secretary general within a short period of time. That hasn't happened. How many years have gone by? 7, 8 years have gone by, and the UNT still hasn't gotten its act together. But the opportunities are there. The fact that the expropriations took place gives the workers a sense of empowerment. And also, the expropriations have taken place along with a new discourse. For instance, Chavez, up until a couple of years ago, stated explicitly that the working class was not the vanguard of the process of change. He stated that before he came to power, and he stated that all along, up until recently, saying that, you look at the behavior of the working class in Venezuela, and it's disappointing. The workers are not a vanguard. But in the last year or two, he has talked about the working class as the vanguard of change in Venezuela. So I think that's important at the level of discourse. And it's also important because he has promoted the idea of worker participation in decision making. And specifically, the Chavez government organized workshops in the Guayana region of Venezuela, which is the industrial base. It's called La Zona de Hierro, where the iron comes from, and the steel company is located, the two aluminum companies are located. And those workshops were designed to establish plans for worker participation in decision making. And Chavez attended those meetings and promoted the ideas and asked the workers, what do you propose? What do you recommend in order to make worker participation a reality? So this gave an impetus to the idea of worker input in decision making. In the steel company and in Alcasa, one of the two big aluminum companies, the president of those two companies are workers. Workers were chosen to head those two companies. But I think that what has happened is that there's been a mixture of two sets of demands and a confusion, a conflation of these two sets of demands. One is worker input in decision making. The other is material benefits to the workers. And in some cases, people have the impression, people in general, and many Chavistas have the impression, that worker participation and the banner of worker control is really a smokescreen for promoting the material interests and the economic demands of the workers. And I'll give you one example. The labor law that's in effect was passed in 1990. The author of that law was the ex and future president of Venezuela, Rafael Caldera. And Caldera was the author of the first labor law, which was passed in 1936. He was only 20 years old at the time. And that first labor law and the second labor law embodies the idea that when a worker gets laid off, he or she, in the case of the 36 law, under certain circumstances, in the case of the 90 law, all workers have the right to receive a severance payment which is calculated on the basis of his or her last monthly salary. So that in an inflationary situation, if you're getting so many months' worth of salaries when you get laid off, according to the severance payment system, but that salary is based on what you were earning while you were a worker. So in my case, for instance, I began working in 1977, and I was earning 4,800 bolívares at the time, which was a lot of money at the time. I was elated. But by the time I retired in 2003, that 4,800 bolívares would practically not be enough to get me a meal, at least a good meal. Maybe McDonald's. But so inflation just ate away at that. And so if I got my severance payment on the basis of what I made in 1977, it would be really a pittance. So that the system was based on the worker's last salary. The neoliberals, and Caldera was one of them. He became president in 1993, 1994. In 1997, neoliberalism eliminated that system. And that was, one of the reasons, one of many, one of the reasons why Chavez was elected president, because the whole political class supported that reform in 1997, the reform of the labor law of 1990, in which the worker no longer got, with a few exceptions, the worker in a couple of sectors of the economy, but most of the workers did not get paid on the basis of his or her last salary. And that was a big blow, because that system of getting paid severance payment on the basis of your last salary is known in Spanish as retroactividad. And that was a household word in Venezuela. I mean, this was an important benefit that was eliminated by neoliberal legislation, supported by Caldera, who was the father of the system to begin with, going back to 1936 and 1990 as well, supported by all the politicians, supported by the CTV labor leadership, which not only supported it, they participated in the designing of the new system. So that did a lot to discredit the entire political class, as well as the labor leaders. And it was the outsiders, the people outside of the political system, that opposed that reform, and Chavez was one of them. Chavez participated on a march protesting against that reform, a march that went to the Supreme Court. So that, since Chavez was identified with opposition to that reform of 1997, there's been a lot of support for reestablishing the old system. The labor law, the new labor law, has been under discussion for I don't know how many years in Congress, maybe 4 or 5 years. And this is one of the controversial elements of that law. The labor leaders are pushing for the reestablishment of the old system of severance payment. And many of the Chavistas say it's just not feasible. I mean, it was feasible at the time, but once that system was eliminated, to return to the old system would be such a burden for the private sector and for the state that at this point we just really can't reestablish the old system. So this is an example of the types of internal conflicts within the Chavez movement, the internal differences within the Chavez movement that you really don't read about, because the National Assembly has been discussing the labor law for many years now, but there's no open discussion about this system of severance payment. The labor leaders keep on saying, this labor law has to be approved in Congress, but there's no discussion of the content of that labor law. I mean, I know about it because I interview labor leaders, and there's some written information on this, but there's really not much open, official, formal discussion about these problems. So I would say, just to summarize, because it's what's that? 5 or 10 minutes. I would say that there are tensions within the Chavista movement. There is a lot of discussion within the Chavista movement, but you don't have the formal mechanisms to channel that discussion in an upward direction, so that the tensions play out, but informally, and not within any kind of organized structure. And so I'll end on this note, that, and this is related to populism, which is one of the topics that I wanted to deal with, and that is populism, as I said before, one of the key elements in populism. Populism is a word that means so many different things to different people, to different scholars. The word has been thrown around a lot. It would really take a whole separate discussion in order to define different views of populism, different definitions of populism that range from pejorative analysis on the part of Gino Giordani, an Italian and Argentine writer in the 1950s, who stated that Perón reminded him of Mussolini, of his home country, Italy. He was a refugee or an immigrant from Italy, and viewed the populist leader as a caudillo, and the followers of that leader as an ignorant mass. But I mentioned Ernesto Laclau, who says that really populism is what politics is all about, and has a whole different set of ideas about populism. But one of the definitions of populism that everybody does agree on, I mentioned the polarization, which is one aspect of populism that I don't think anybody would disagree with. And the other is that populism implies weak organization and lack of well-defined ideological goals. The populist leader promotes reform, promotes change, and is thus able to appeal to the people who want transformation. But that kind of change is kind of left ambiguous. But the people who write about populism in a positive light, myself included, because I've written on populism, state that this is transient, that the fact that there's a lack of definition and lack of organization doesn't mean that that is necessarily permanent, because the leader, far from being a caudillo who wants to stay in power as long as he or she can and doesn't care about organization, doesn't care about ideology, that's not always the case. That's not necessarily the case. And so a populist regime can be in a state of transformation. And so at what point, I ask in some of my writing, does that government or does that movement cease to be populist? When you have an accumulation of experiences and a transformation of organization and a development of ideology, at what point do you no longer use the populist tag in order to define that government? I would argue that, in the case of Chavez, there's a weak organization, that the movement is in the process of defining itself. There's a very rich kind of debate going on informally, but I would locate the weak element, the downside of Chavismo, as the lack of organization that allows the movement to take this informal debate, which goes on, and it goes on because the Chavista activists, or ex-leftists, or not ex-leftists, they're leftists with a lot of experience. The average Chavista activist, in my opinion, was involved in the guerrilla movement of the 60s, or if they're younger, they were involved in different leftist organizations in the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s. So these people naturally were debating things, as you would expect. But the lack of organization that would allow the rank and file and the activists to discuss these experiences, if 21st century socialism is trial and error socialism, if it's innovative, then errors are inevitable. But the idea isn't to avoid committing errors, the idea is to avoid committing errors a second time. And for that to happen, there has to be debate, and it's got to be organized debate, and you've got to have mechanisms and structures in order to channel that discussion in an upward direction, to influence the policymakers, to influence the decision-making process. And I'll just give you one example in order to clarify what I'm referring to. And that is, I believe that the starting point to correct some of the errors is a semi-autonomous political party. You couldn't expect the party to be autonomous. The Chavista party is not going to be autonomous of the state, but it should be, in my opinion, semi-autonomous, which means that it's able to criticize, it's able to point the finger at erroneous policies and at inefficient or undesirable government officials. It's got to be a watchdog body. Liberal democracy is good on that. Liberal democracy talks of the system of checks and balances. Radical democracy, since it emphasizes majority rule, tends to pass over the intermediate structures between the people who are calling the shots and the majority. So radical democracy tends to be weak on organization. And that's the case also with populism, weak organization. In the case of the official party, the PSUV, that was created after Chavez was re-elected president in 2006, in 2007 he created the PSUV, and it's a mass-based party, and the party has up until now one thing going for it, and that is up until now the party has held internal elections for its authorities and to choose its candidates in elections, something that the opposition doesn't do for the most part. But the Chavistas have. They've called internal elections for municipal council elections in 2005. For party authority, I think in 2003, they held internal elections. For the elections for governor and mayor in 2008, they held internal elections to choose those candidates. In 2009, they held internal elections to choose delegates to the party's extraordinary Congress, held in late 2009, early 2010. And then they held internal elections to choose the candidates for the National Assembly in elections that were held later on that year, 2010. So up until now, they've had a good track record. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. There's some talk of not holding elections for upcoming internal elections to choose candidates for the upcoming elections for the governorship and for the mayors. But up until now, they've held internal elections. The problem is that the party has been controlled by the state structure. The governors, the mayors tend to control the party at their levels. And at a regional level, the PSUV has vice presidents for different regions. And most of those vice presidents are ministers. So that the party is really closely tied to the state. And that discourages the rank and file because they feel that when there are internal elections, the state, whether it be the governor or the mayor, they impose their candidates. There's a term that's used in Venezuela, I don't know in the case of El Salvador and other countries, but it's chuleta. Chuleta is a slate. And it's a slate that the party leaders make up. And they tell their people to vote for that slate. So in internal elections, they will say, for instance, a mayor will tell the municipal workers who belong to the party, this is the slate you're going to, here's the chuleta. Chuleta also means professors. The students have, write down a little piece of paper, the answers to the questions, and whip it out and look at it. What's that?
In Chile, torpedo.
What's it called?
Torpedo in Chile.
Well, in Venezuela it's called chuleta. And that same chuleta is what the mayors and the governors use to get their people to vote for the candidates that they're endorsing. So that's the downside of internal democracy. And I think that is what the Chavista movement has to work on. Because that, I think, is the most effective mechanism at this point to analyze the errors that are being committed in order to overcome them. Thank you.